Hey there, and welcome to Insights from the Inside by Modyo. This is a show where we'll explore current technology trends related to the development of digital experiences and products, all from the perspectives of industry experts, insiders, and thought leaders. The whole purpose of this is to basically host one special guest each month and discuss topics that are going to range from anything in, for instance, product development, financial technology innovation, organizational-wide digital transformation, and much more. And the purpose really is to give you, the audience, insights from the inside for what it takes to build and deliver great experiences. I'm your host, Wesley Campbell. In today's episode, we're talking to Kalle Bylin. Kalle is a product engineer here at Modyo and in charge of two of our products, Modyo Customers and Modyo Insights. And he works closely with many companies to understand how they're using data in the context of their digital products. Kalle graduated from Los Andes University in Bogota with degrees in business administration, social psychology, and Chinese language and culture. He first approached data science as a discipline during his time at LATAM Airlines, which is one of the largest airline groups in the world. He then went on to become a machine learning and AI mentor at Udacity and served as an industry expert mentor for the online postgraduate program in artificial intelligence and machine learning by UT Austin and MIT's Applied Data Science Bootcamp, both in collaboration with Great Learning, which is an online professional learning company with a global footprint in over 140 countries. Kalle is an expert in data science and behavioral analytics for product development. So we're very happy to talk to him today, and without further ado, I bring you Kalle Bylin. So, hey Kalle, how are you doing? Welcome to the show, man.
Hey Wes, thank you very much. It's so great to be here, and especially with you.
Yeah, I know. It's like, it feels a little strange because we work together a lot, but you have a lot of experience outside of just our work together at Modyo. So we thought you'd be a great guest on the podcast, especially talking about our topic today, which we're going to talk a lot about product development, specifically data-driven product development. So why don't you, for the people out there, I will have already given you some kind of introduction, but why don't you, from the horse's mouth, not that I'm calling you a horse, but why don't you give us a little bit of intro about yourself?
Yes, of course. So I'm currently product engineer here at Modyo. I'm in charge of Modyo Customers and Modyo Insights, and it's been really an amazing year. I've been here for a bit over a year now, and the experiences I've had with different clients and how they use data to build the digital products has just been amazing. It's been very eye-opening for me and a very humbling experience as well. I'm super excited about things we can do in the future in terms of collecting data and helping our clients out. On that side, a bit on my background, I'm originally from Sweden, but half Colombian. I've been here in Colombia for 10 years now, where I married my amazingly awesome wife. And that's why I'm here right now. And basically, I've been in different companies, LATAM Airlines, for example, working with data. Then I've also been mentor in different types of programs with UT Austin, MIT, and so on. So a lot of different people and a lot of different perspectives on how people or companies are using data. So I hope some of that experience I hope I can share some of that experience here today.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, it definitely helps us out at the company for sure. I mean, even the few talks that we've had internally, I've gotten a lot of illumination from you, and that's why we invited you on the show, because we think that this will be a very great discussion. So, but let's back up a little bit and just basically for these first-time listeners or people that are curious about the topic of what it takes to develop a product and all the management therein. Why don't you let us know, give us a rundown of basics of product development? I mean, basically, how would you describe it to your family? What are the common metrics that product developers typically look for?
Okay, that's a great question. Great place to start. So if I were talking to my family, I would probably not jump straight into explaining product management or development. I would probably start with why it is important. And I told you, Wes, a time back that one of my favorite authors is Peter Drucker. I shared a couple of book recommendations with you. And one of those books, I remember he has a whole chapter on the purpose of business. And his definition of the purpose of a business is to create a customer. He also later adds on, it's to create a customer and to keep a customer. And the thing I find kind of special of that particular quote is that he mentions that it's what the customer thinks he's buying and what he considers valuable that defines who we are. And that thing that the customer buys and that thing that he finds valuable is never a product or a service. It's always utility, what the product or the service does for him or her. And so that goes hand in hand with Melissa Perry's definition of products, because she says that products are vehicles of value. You basically create something that ends up working as a vehicle where you put your value and you deliver it to your customers over and over and over again without requiring the company to build something new every single time. And Melissa Perry is the author of the Build Trap. And so I think that kind of gives us the context for everything we do in product and product management when it comes to data. We want to understand the customer and what the customer thinks is valuable, so that we can create something that we can use over and over and over again to give value to our clients. That would basically be the center. I don't know if you have any comments or before I move on with the metrics and everything.
No, I mean, it's a great clarification. I think that a lot of times when people think about products or services, I mean, the vehicle metaphor makes a lot of sense, right? You're talking about ultimately this concept that you mentioned, utility. The concept, is it useful, right? Is it useful? And that asking the questions about that usefulness is, I guess we'll get more into that later, but it has a lot to do with empathy for the end client. You know, whether that end client happens to be the business that you're building the product for, or for their clients, for the people that are going to use it, whether that's an onboarding sequence or, you know, we can get into the weeds there. But so let's go back and let's talk a little bit more about what are the kind of basic metrics that typical product development or product managers are looking out for.
Yeah, definitely. So in this whole process, in this product development process, now that we talked about the why and so on, you often have these different stages. You have your ideation stage, you prioritize, you build, measure, and then you roll out, and then you start over again. And so a lot of people think that the data that you collect is only focused on this measuring. This after you build, you measure, and then you roll out and you test and over again. But in the end, you can actually use data throughout this whole process in every single step, and the types of metrics that you collect are very, very important. So first of all, always your ROI, which is your return on investment. That is always important, because if you're not keeping your eye on that particular metric, and if your ROI is negative, then in the end, you're actually destroying value. You're taking something that has a certain value to begin with, and then you're giving it away for less value. So if your ROI is negative. So your vehicle, your product, your vehicle that is taking value from your company to the user is actually just destroying value. Then on the other side, another metric you want to always have as a basic is your active users. How many people are using your product? And that could be daily, weekly, or monthly. And so some people, they're going to tell you this is a vanity metric. And it is, if it's the only thing you have. You have to have, if it's the only perspective you have, then it's definitely a vanity metric, because you can see the numbers go up, and then in the end, people might not be using the product as you would expect, and you're just destroying value there as well. So active users in that sense. So when does it not become a vanity metric? It's when you compare it to maybe your conversion rate or your retention rate. And so recently with you specifically, and with Mark and some others here internally, we've been talking a lot about connection events. And so you can think about a connection event like the core action of your digital product. And I love talking about connection events, because in the end, a conversion is often when I'm a lead and I'm maybe a person who's interested in the site, and then I fill in my data and I convert, I become a lead, or I'm a lead and then I convert into a customer. But what happens when I'm already a customer and I'm coming back and back? I don't convert every single time. Instead, I'm connecting with the company over and over and over again. And so for me, for example, just as a more tangible example, is for me, clicking play on Spotify is my connection event with Spotify. Mm-hmm. I'm already a customer. So I'm not converting per se, but every time I click play, my interests of wanting to enjoy music are aligned with the interests of Spotify, and everything else that Spotify has created in their product is just there to help me play more and more often and periodically over time. And so I think they've done a good job, because I've been a customer with Spotify since they were 6 months old. So I've been there for years and years. So that would be my connection event there.
You were an early adopter there. Yeah.
Exactly.
What was there anything, I mean, speaking as a product manager, I don't know where you were at in your life at the time, but was there anything that stood out to you? Because obviously they've been tremendously successful and I know that in a lot of ways, a lot of product managers look at companies like Spotify to see how they've iterated and grown and changed the product from what it used to be to what it is now. Is there anything that you saw in what they were doing early on that attracted you in that sense, or were you just being just another user who found it extremely, let's use the correct term, found the utility very high, and and you just really wanted to go with it? I mean, what's the story there as being an early adopter?
Well, that's an interesting story. I found out about Spotify because it's a Swedish company, obviously. So I had this a bit insider news, newspapers there in Sweden and so on. And so I found out about Spotify, and back then it was actually by invitation. So you needed to have an invitation to be on Spotify, and that felt special. That felt like, oh, I'm part of something that not everybody gets to be part of. So that was kind of special. And then obviously just the fact that I could listen to music basically for free, because in that very big back then they weren't still monetizing, for example. So a lot of the music they had was basically free, and you could add your own music to Spotify and everything. So that was a really nice experience. But then what actually got me converted me into a more power user was when they started using all of this interaction data to make the product better and stickier, in the sense of recommendation systems and special playlists. For me, the Discovery Weekly feature, that's something I use every single week. Every single week, Mondays, when my Discover Weekly playlist gets updated, I go through that whole playlist, and I just find every single week, I promise you, I find nuggets of music I had never found before. And I just enjoy them and listen to those over and over again. So that kind of features where you build upon the data that the product is collecting to give you a better experience, that's something that definitely has me sold.
That's really funny. This is a great plug for Spotify, our talk right here, because I've been talking about how great it is. No, but it's interesting to hear that one of the things that attracted you in terms of maybe not necessarily developing the product itself, but in terms of a rollout or a strategy there, is to offer early adopters this kind of exclusivity, right? Mm-hmm. Where you get this sense that you're part of an in crowd, and you almost know that you're being tested upon, if that makes sense, because not everyone is getting access to it. And so maybe that gives people a little bit more empathy for the product, because the product's basically having empathy for them. So yeah, that's really interesting. So are there any other metrics that we typically look for, or is that like more or less like I mean, I know that the world is massive in terms of what you're looking for in products, but it's interesting what you talk about, for instance, the interplay of how you can have some metrics that matter, like total users, but that otherwise could be vanity if you don't have other metrics that support them. Are there any other interesting, like definite interplays in terms of metrics that you have to deal with in product?
Yeah, definitely. So first of all, I would add satisfaction types of metrics. So I won't give it. There are a lot of different types of satisfaction metrics, but just as an example, the NPS, the Net Promoter Score, is a great example of a satisfaction metric that you can use to compare your vanity metrics to. The Net Promoter Score was originally introduced by Bain & Company, and I think it's gained a lot of traction because in general it's very difficult to measure value. So we're talking about utility, and how do you measure utility? How do you even define utility for everybody? That's super difficult. So something that's still very intuitive is that, and that we all understand, is that people tend to recommend things that they like, because it's nice when you recommend something, a book or a song, and the other person's like, yeah, this was really good, thank you for recommending this. And we don't recommend things that we don't like, because if I recommend something, a book or a song to you, for example, and then you come back and you say that this wasn't good at all, then that's my word at stake. It's kind of my identity you're attacking. So I really refrain from recommending things that I think are not really good. So that's why the Net Promoter Score makes a lot of sense. Then apart from that, I'll just add two more. Maybe and these are groups of kind of metrics or things you want to keep an eye on. First is feature usage. So we usually, once we launched our MVP and we start building upon a product and adding different features, just as I mentioned with Spotify, so maybe your playlist and this Discovery Weekly feature and so on, you don't want to maintain features that are not adding value to your customers or your users, because you're just spending money on something that is not really adding any value. So you want to be able to see which features are not being used, but then also the other side of things. You want to be able to identify the features that add the most value to customers, especially if you're, for example, in a freemium type of model, because then you know which features you can give away for free. And then this very special feature that everybody loves, that's the one you charge for. So being able to have your feature usage has these both sides of things that you want to keep your eye on. And then user paths as well. As you take a look at your different user paths, you know where people are maybe struggling or having problems and so on.
Yeah, that's interesting, because as you were speaking, it got me thinking about how the business model of the product you're offering, for instance, a subscription based versus, buying a license, or that there's different ways that freemium, for instance, that you mentioned, that could impact the way in which the product itself functions. Because for the freemium thing, for example, you have to give enough value that people are interested in using it, but then you don't want to give away too much, but then you also can't withhold certain features that would otherwise make the thing unusable, right? So
exactly.
So the way you have that model ends up impacting it's almost like the freemium model has its own onboarding system internal through the usage of the product itself, that could have a great impact on what you decide to highlight or not highlight and things there. It's super interesting.
Exactly. Yeah. No. And then maybe just to close that off, I'd also recommend, this is not a metric per se, but then the fact of being able to segment your different users in different ways, that is definitely very valuable. So one example is the one we talked about just a moment ago. You were talking about early adopters and how I was an early adopter for Spotify. So being able to find your champions or differentiating those from people that are about to hibernate or leave your product, or your new users, that's very valuable, because your champions, you can do things like the one I just mentioned with Spotify. You can give them special invitations to a new product or a new feature and get their feedback. And you don't want to do that with all of your different users. And so understanding how different users are using different features and so on, that's really important as well. So we can't forget about segmenting the data and not only looking at the aggregates. Aggregates are very dangerous sometimes.
Okay, yeah, right. So again, it's important to kind of have a bigger picture, but then also being a little bit more granular. That's great. So we know that this kind of topic we want to talk about today is data-driven, and we're talking a lot about data already with metrics, but I just wanted to shoot you a question here about this concept of, and maybe this has to do a little bit with what you're talking about in terms of quantitative data, which, you're collecting a lot of information there, versus, say, qualitative data. So over at Snowplow, Yali Sassoon, who's one of the co-founders, I believe. By the way, for those who don't know what Snowplow is they're a platform that deal in behavioral data. They wrote about the role of data in product development in this kind of dual sense, and specifically brought up a point about qualitative versus quantitative data. So Yali pointed out, he said, quantitative data describing how users actually engage with products might be used to uncover if the product is being used in a way that hasn't been anticipated, or if particular workflows are cumbersome and awkward. Qualitative feedback can be used to identify how users feel about different aspects of the product, potentially highlighting areas that frustrate users, even if the quantitative data suggests that users still successfully navigate those parts of the product. Now, that's interesting, because given how these two types of feedback could potentially conflict, right? You have individual accounts, qualitative, that they're telling you, hey, this is a bad experience, despite the fact that people are still completing the process. What I'm curious from you is there a side you tend to listen to or believe more often in the face of things? And how do you really balance the interplay between those two things, especially when they can conflict?
So if the question is if there's one of those that I tend to listen to more, then I actually think that the real question is how we can avoid listening to one more than the other. Because in general, I find, or at least with people I've talked to and worked with, is that people tend to listen, and that's definitely my case as well, to quantitative data more than qualitative data, because it's quote unquote easier in a sense. Because especially, for example, if you're an introvert, for example, going out and talking to people is very difficult. And just even more simpler, it's quantitative data is never going to tell you straight out that your product is garbage. You're not going to look at the numbers, and it's never going to tell you your product is garbage. You might see indicators and things that might be wrong. You see some indicators dropping and so on, but those tend to be quite easy to explain away, and you might end up using the data in the wrong way. But once you start collecting real qualitative data from users and start talking to them maybe one-on-one, that's when you have to be vulnerable and ready for that person to tell you something that you don't like, or telling you that the product you've been working on for the last 5 years or 10 years is not worth it, or is not valuable for them. And that's difficult to hear. So in the end, I think we tend to listen to quantitative a bit more. Now that you were talking, I remembered an example of a product. It was a financial product, not one of our customers. This is a much older example, but basically they had this idea of trying to make logging into their product much easier. So they thought, okay, let's integrate it with Facebook. And so they had this login with Facebook feature, and looking at the data, just as I mentioned, the quantitative data, they saw that the usage of this particular feature was very, very low. And so they started iterating and trying to make it more visible and easier to use, and then trying a lot of different things. And after a while, they decided to talk to a few customers, and talking to them, they said that they didn't want Facebook for this type of product, because they had the sense that maybe what they were doing inside of the financial product could be published on their feed on Facebook. So they didn't trust Facebook for this particular thing. And that's an insight you'll never be able to get from the quantitative data alone. You have to be able to talk to people and listen to what they think. And so how maybe do we find the balance? That's the last question you were asking there. And I think it's really important to set up processes from the very start, from the outset, for both types of feedback. Because once you have your data pipeline set up and you have your dashboard and the way to query your data, your quantitative data, it becomes very natural to come back to that. And we have several dashboards that we built here internally in Modyo. And so it's easy to come back to those dashboards over and over again on a weekly basis and so on. But it's not as normal to have a process for qualitative data. It's not so normal for people to say, okay, every quarter we're going to talk to people, or we're going to get some customers on, and we're going to give them some credits or something on Amazon for them to tell us what they think about our product. And so there are different ways you can go about this. But one way obviously is using tools like Hotjar, for example, where you can ask people for feedback directly on the digital product. Mm-hmm. But then it's very useful to have periodic initiatives to connect with your users and stick to that process in the long haul. So I've had the opportunity to talk with a lot of our different clients with respect to Modyo customers and Modyo Insights, for example, and the ideas they come with, or the pains they come with as well. Those are things that we would never in all of our different teammates and everything and so on. So it's super important to have both sides there and set up a process for both sides. That would be my recommendation.
Yeah, that's interesting to talk about. Okay, not only, the process of saying, hey, I know that I need to balance the two. It's never going to be one or the other. And there are certain things that quantitative can tell you that qualitative can't, but qualitative can definitely give you key insights like what you're just saying that you couldn't get otherwise. And so the question there, I guess, as a follow-up is, there's different ways to gain qualitative data. And so in doing that, you're talking about having maybe sit-down interviews. I mean, I know that there's a few different ways that you can do this through plugins on a website. Do you find, at some point you want people to tell you the honest truth about something, about some kind of experience, and and I know there's even varying degrees of detail, because sometimes people don't want to. I recall a lot of times when they do this in the physical world, where you'll have done something and then you pass by a kiosk that has a series of smiley faces that go from frowning to kind of neutral and then happy. And, I could touch whatever I want, and it's really, I have no idea what they're going to do with that. I mean, it's really just a single input. So at what point is that useful because that's I guess a qualitative thing. I'm saying here was the quality of this was good or bad, but there's no detail there. How do you see in terms of the detail-oriented qualitative feedback being beneficial? I mean, are those smiley faces beneficial? Can we do things with that, or in your opinion, no? If we really want to gain good insight, we should take it to the level like what you were talking about at Modyo, where you're talking to people directly, or no, some middle ground is good. A form where we have something through a plugin that asks people a couple questions in a survey, and then that's good enough. I mean, how do you know how much granularity you need in your qualitative data?
Okay, so the important thing to keep in mind there is that concept that you yourself are using there, Wes, which is the granularity and how much you need. And what I can tell you is that whenever you're going to use data, you have different types of questions that you want to answer. And so one thing with decision making specifically is that in the past, and we're getting better and better at that right now, is that people have made a lot of decisions based on their gut feeling and so on, and people are starting to understand how to use data and so on. But then in some cases, people go to the other extreme, and it's, I always need data to be able to make a decision, and that leads you to analysis paralysis and so on. When it's actually the case that if you have a low stakes type of decision, then going with your gut feeling might actually be the optimum way of going, because it's not worth going so deep into these other things. And in other cases, when it's high stakes, then you need to collect your data. And the reason I mentioned that right now is because, well, if you want to know when to use more qualitative data and less qualitative data, because obviously meeting people one-on-one is much more expensive in terms of resources and time and everything compared to doing a focus group, for example, versus just collecting data through this kind of with buttons in a mall or something, or just collecting quantitative data in some other way. So you have this whole spectrum of different tools. And that's why I would say it depends on how high the stakes of the decision. If it's high stakes, low stakes, that it depends on that first, how important it is. But then on the other hand, you can't forget about doing these things periodically. I would say you can definitely get away with a focus group or surveys every now and then, but you should never leave the one-on-one interviews out completely. If we remember Peter Drucker's quote on the purpose of the business being creating a customer, we need to understand what is valuable to a customer. And so we need to be able to have one-on-one conversations, knowing that these people might not be representative of the whole population, but still these conversations give us really valuable insights that we can work on. And usually the way it goes is I have a one-on-one conversation with someone, and they might say, I think this is very painful, and I think this would be very useful. And then I take all of those different ideas and we can create a survey. And then we send them out to more people, let's say 100 or 500 people, to see if those opinions of that one person are representative of the whole group. And so you can ask multiple people, and they'll say, no, I don't agree with that pain. This is not painful for me, or I really think that I need this, and so on. And so you can build upon the different sources of data to get a more complete picture. That would be a bit the way to go.
Okay, perfect. So I like the idea that one-on-one talks, because you're just going to get more honesty there than you will everywhere else. Mm-hmm. So I like the idea that having that one-on-one is almost a necessary ingredient in terms of the qualitative side of things. I think that's super fascinating.
You also mentioned, just sorry for interrupting you there, the honesty, the honesty part, Wes. It's often not a good idea to tell people that you're the person working on the product, because then people tend not to be honest. So it's a good idea to go out there, and if you're trying to talk to someone one-on-one, maybe say, I'm researching for this company, or I'm researching for this product, and I'm going to tell the product people what you think, and so on. So you can be completely honest with me, but maybe not let them know straight out that you are the person in charge of that product, because people tend to be nice to you. People hate hurting your feelings.
It's interesting how people have empathy. It's like, if you go to them, you have to be at least once removed from being the owner of the thing, because everyone knows what it's like. I mean, we talk a lot about people becoming customers and really feeling attached to things, and when they recommend things, it's because it's it's their word, as you said. I mean, it's almost like an extension of themselves, this product or this brand or something, because they use it, whether it's, clothes for their identity or some kind of app they use and what have you. So the recommendation comes at a risk, really, but then they're willing to do it. So in this case, when you're talking about having a sense of closeness to something that's not you, and we're talking about products, people instantly empathize with that because we all do it all the time, and so they're not willing to give you that direct kind of feedback that you honestly need to hear. I mean, they call it tough love, but the person doesn't know you. There's not a lot of love to give, so they would rather defer to politeness. That's really funny. So for those of you that are listening, that's a great insight. Is if you want to get good product feedback, don't let your product owners or product managers do it. Let someone else give it, or at least tell them to fib and put on their surveyor cap. Just pretend to be someone conducting a survey. That's great. Well, I'd like to move on a little bit and maybe continue to ask you something else here. So I've heard you discuss before, and this is very interesting for me in terms of the thinking about the data itself. And so I've heard you discuss about the importance of the data we gather in products kind of accurately reflecting the reality of what we're dealing with. So, customer purchasing, onboarding, whatever. And that not only can this sometimes be difficult to do to get an accurate picture with data, but that too, even if you gather accurate data, that data can be misinterpreted or misunderstood through flawed thinking or logical fallacies. And I think you give some talks internally in the company with some exercises that were interesting because people thought they knew what they were interpreting, but they did not do it correctly. So are there any common examples of this that product managers can fall into when making decisions based on their interpreting the data? And how, in general, can we all get more accurate pictures by looking at data in order to avoid these pitfalls?
Yeah, definitely. So I'll maybe start off by saying that I'm definitely one of the people who has fallen into these pitfalls. That's why I'm going to share them with you. I'm not sharing them from a point of, I know better than everybody else. And that happened to me. I fell down, and
you haven't come down from the mountain to tell all the other product managers what they should and shouldn't do.
Exactly. It's been pain, and I've made a lot of mistakes. But so one place where we could start is this customer development cycle we were just talking about a moment ago. So when we're talking about interviewing people and getting to know them in order to understand what's valuable for them, it's not uncommon for product teams to ask for feedback internally within their own team. So they start asking each other, I did this. What do you think about it? No, I like this, or I don't like this, and let's work on this. And then when everybody's happy, they push it out into production, and the results are not what they expected. And so what they did there is called sampling bias, even though some of them might say, but I'm a user of this. I'm an actual user. So I'm someone who could, my opinion is valid. But you have sampling bias. And that means simply that the sample of people you chose is not representative of the whole population of actual users. So you're focusing on a subgroup, and usually the people working in your company, they tend to be for the type of product you're building, even though they're users. So think about Slack. Slack uses Slack internally. Still, the employees are Slack. They tend to be a bit more power users than people that are using Slack in other companies. So they're not necessarily representative of the whole population. So that would be one first mistake there, or pitfall that you could fall in. Another one, for example, is running experiments or trying to test things without counterfactuals or a control version. And this happens a lot, specifically in type of retail context, but also digital products type of context, because we have this time series component of things happening over time, and we want to change things. We want to change, for example, our conversion rate, or we want to change the number of active users and the growth of the product and so on. And so if you look at a timeline of what you're building, of your product, or of a specific metric, let's say active users, and at the particular date, you deploy a new feature, and then 5 months later, you compare your number of active daily users, and let's say it went up. And then some people might say, okay, this is great. We published this feature, and now the number of active users, it just grew a lot. And then the problem is you don't know if that was actually caused by the feature you have. It could simply be a seasonality factor. It could be something else that happened externally. And if you would have compared it to a control group, it might even have been the case that the people who used the feature versus how it was before, it could have grown anyways, but not as much as the control group. So your feature might have been worse than how you were before, and the growth of this metric is hiding that from you. So you have to be able to look at these and compare things to be able to see if there's some type of causality. Those are two first pitfalls. Another pitfall, and this is something we've talked about several times with US, is the fact of making decisions after looking at the data. And I think, and we have had conversations about this in marketing and so on. And some people might say, okay, how can you make a decision before you look at the data? I mean, I need the data to make the decision. And the way I'm going to explain this is, imagine we're launching maybe a new product, and we decide to create, as a product team, and with you, Wes, with our marketing team, we say, okay, let's create a landing page and see how many potential users sign up for this particular new feature or new product, and use that as a way to determine if there is a market for that product. And so ideally, we would decide beforehand, based on maybe the revenue goals that we might need to keep this alive and everything, that we need at least 2,000 leads to confirm interest of this product, to give it a go. And so when the data comes in, if I made that decision beforehand, then the decision is black and white. I already know what to do. But the problem is, people tend to send out these experiments and then they try to make the decision afterwards. And the problem with this is that this is more about our biases and what we actually think in our heart, rather than the actual objective results. Because if I am somebody who was against the product or the feature from the very start, then we might get 1,000 leads, and I'll just say, no, that's not enough. We needed 5,000 maybe to get the product out, and we never came down to that beforehand. But I'm just trying to stop the product any way I can. And it also happens the other way around. If we get 1,000 different leads, then I might say, if I'm somebody who really am invested in that idea and I really wanted to come out, even though the numbers are not as good as expected, I might just be, but 1,000 is not so bad. It could have been worse. We should do this anyway. And so it's no longer a conversation, an objective conversation about the data and if we should do it or not. It becomes a conversation around opinions. It's, I think we should do it anyway, or I think we shouldn't do it. And everybody gets their own opinion in there. So that also makes it a bit troubling. So whenever a good idea that you might do is have a simple decision matrix. That's a tool that you can use where you can have a clear picture in advance for all of these different scenarios. So you can have your metric 1 and metric 2 and metric 3 and say, okay, if there is a success in metric 2, then what do we do? If there's no change in metric 2, then what we do? If metric 2 fails, then what do we do? And you could have rollback and rollout, or reevaluate, or not do anything. And all of these different things already defined beforehand. So those are a couple of examples there. I think I can come up with more examples, but I don't know, Wes, how are we in terms of time?
No, we're okay with time. It's interesting, though. It's the way you explain things about declaring or taking decisions beforehand or after the fact that you have the data. It's funny how at first it's okay, I could maybe see how it could be both, but then once you explain it, it becomes patently obvious. I mean, to me, I think of a metaphor of American football, where there's a lot of rules in that game, and a lot of people, even if you are not too familiar with the sport, there's end zones, right? Imagine, if you will, a version of the game where the coach says, okay, we're on one side of the field, we're just going to say this strategy, and we're going to see how far this strategy takes us downfield. And there's no end zone. We just see how far we go. And then you have some people that don't like the strategy or do like it, that say, oh, look at, we didn't go that far, but what if it turns out that you only needed to go 100 yards or 100 meters and you went 130? Well, no one ever defined where the end zone was. So that person can say whatever they want. And same thing, vice versa. Someone can say, even if they only went 30 yards or 30 meters, can say, oh, look, this was a fantastic strategy, despite the fact that we know, I mean, the football would typically be 100 yards away. So, it's in the context of, say, sports where you need well-defined rules because it's extremely competitive. I mean, of course you have to know ahead of time. You have to know ahead of time. That's how the whole thing works. And so that's very insightful. I think that's it's quite interesting.
And specifically, I love that you bring sports into this, because sports is a great example of where this happens a lot. And not only making decisions before having the data, but also judging decisions based on the result. That's something you can't do. You should judge a decision based on the data or the information somebody had at the moment where they made the decision. And it happens a lot in sports. And I'm going to talk about soccer instead of
that's good. We'll balance things out. We got to keep things global. So I'm showing how American I am by thinking in terms of American football. So go ahead.
Yeah, so I'll talk about soccer instead. And it's so common that maybe you decided you're in the World Cup final, and then you have to make a decision. If you try to do some type of play, or you do something else, or you put one player in instead of another player, for example. And so if you let's say that you have the stats as a coach, and you know that this player works very well in this type of situations, and you put him into the field, and you have this other player who's known for scoring goals, but in that particular type of situation, he doesn't do as well. And so you put this other player in, and it fails, and you lose the World Cup. And then everybody just blowing up and saying, why did you put this player into the field? You should have chosen the other guy. The other guy is the one who scores, and so on. And that's a problem. They're judging the decision based on the result. When, if you look objectively on the data, using that player was the decision that made the most sense. And we shouldn't regret making that decision afterwards, even though we know that it was not the expected outcome.
Well, I got news for you that I don't think even if everyone in the world listens to our podcast today, I don't think that anyone's going to stop judging people after the fact. I mean, I can't imagine a stadium full of people saying, "Oh yeah, I get what your decision you made. Oh well, I went home." That'll never happen. But it's
the thing is, there's also an information imbalance. So as a fan, I usually don't have those stats in mind and so on. So I mean, it's part of the fun. It's part of the fun not knowing and then just getting mad at things. So yeah, we'll probably not change the world with this particular podcast, but just so we know that's exactly a bit how it works.
Well, so actually to pick up and we'll move into the kind of the next section where this concept of making a judgment after you have the data and you have to make those judgments to make a call on something. I know that a huge important part is kind of one thing to basically gather customer data, and plenty of companies, we hear all times about the glut of data, that there's so much data out there with products and customers, but then it's another thing to be able to understand and interpret it. And that's where I came across this concept in talking to you and doing research for the topic today, that this concept of product analytics, and that what product analytics, it's been said, it's about really scaling customer empathy by understanding how users interact with a product and how it fits into people's everyday lives. So how do product analytics, how do you deliver on this promise of empathy purely through data? Like, what are the established frameworks, or are there frameworks or patterns that product managers use to analyze data and draw out meaningful insights? I mean, it's easy to get an insight from someone to say, I hate your product because this button doesn't work. But how do you glean things like this, or maybe different from that, just by looking at data? I mean, how do the analytics work there?
So one starting point, at least, I think, is it's a people's problem and a cultural problem as well. And in the past, I mean, this is not even a couple of decades ago, you would talk to people about data and the importance of data, and people would actually give it less value or think of it as less important than your intuition or your gut feeling. It's today, after we've proven, or we have this proof over and over and over again of the value of data, that people today have this almost hype around data, and we need data for everything and so on. But just a couple of decades ago, that wasn't the case. People really didn't think that data was valuable at all. So that has been changing a bit. And so one particular perspective that I like a lot and that has guided my way of thinking in many ways is how Airbnb looks at data and data science. And so I've read through several blog posts by Riley Newman, the first data scientist they had over at Airbnb. He's not there anymore, but these blog posts, they talked about them looking at data as the aggregated voice of the customer. So you can think of if we go back to product development, you can think about the product manager as the person who is actually representing the customer in front of all of the other stakeholders. You want the product manager, even though he might not be the boss, quote unquote, of the people in the team, he's just working with them. You want somebody who represents the customer. And so you can use data to represent the customer by thinking of it as the aggregate voice of your customer, because you can't always talk to them one-on-one. And then data science becomes the act of trying to interpret the data or this voice in a way that we can understand, almost like translating that voice in a way that we can understand and gain insights from that. And so in terms of product analytics itself, over the years, this has been changing a lot in the last few years, because previously you would find all of these larger companies, like specifically Airbnb or Spotify or Netflix, Alibaba, LinkedIn, and all of them building these very complicated data architectures that allow them to collect all types of data events that they can then use to trigger real-time actions and for data modeling and analysis. But this was not often possible for smaller companies. So we tended to just be happy tagging things with Google Analytics and we took Tag Manager and we created a goal or a conversion event with Google Analytics and see how that went on. But then over time, we found that that was not enough, because if you think about it, Google Analytics was actually a company originally called Urchin, which was launched in 2005. That's a long time ago. And back then, web pages, they weren't as dynamic or complex like they are today. So in that time, you cared mostly about how many people, this what we now call the vanity metric, but at that time, how many people arrived at your site and how they got there, where they came from. And so Google Analytics has historically been very, very good at that. Especially because two main sources of traffic is, well, organic Google search traffic and paid Google ads. So Google has been really good at that, and Google Analytics at understanding that. But over time, it started falling a bit behind with respect to helping us understand how users behave once they are on your digital product. And that's what product analytics tries to solve in that way, trying to understand how people behave and how they're using your particular product. So in the end, when you were asking about a framework or how things are working today. And I think one thing I've seen a lot is this rise of collecting not only business events, but events in general as a unopinionated type of log of facts that happened, objective facts. So you don't have an opinion of that data, or just to differentiate a bit, you can collect your data as events, as simple facts of things that happened, or you can aggregate data as you store it with a business kind of opinion in mind from the very outset. So you could store your data in terms of users and sessions, for example, and then look at the data afterwards. The problem is, once you want to look at that data from a different perspective, you can't anymore, because that data is already transformed in a way. So one best practice and one type of a way of collecting data that's catching on a lot today is this idea of collecting events as unopinionated logs of immutable facts that happened in the past. And so the reason this is so good is because, first of all, you can separate, and this goes a bit more technical there, but writing from reading in your database. A lot of us know that as we scale the usage of our databases and so on, trying to read and write things from the same database, that can cause a lot of difficulties. And when you start connecting different components to each other in a way where all of these things have very strong connections, it makes it very difficult to evolve that digital product, because you end up with this huge mess or ball of things that are connected to each other, and it makes it very difficult to move on. And so when you have a single stream of log events and these unopinionated things that you keep as a log, then you can basically just save things to the end of this queue, basically, of events coming on. And then you can connect different systems to that particular log or that particular stream of events that are happening. So you could have triggering things as events come in, but then you could also have a team of analysts or data scientists taking that complete log and then modeling it in different ways that make sense for the questions they want to answer. So one day I might take the log and then look at it from users' perspective, or I might take the same log and then look at it from a sessions perspective, and so on. And so if you look at well-known players out there like Pendo and Heap and Snowplow and Amplitude, all of these different tools that now help smaller customers build this type of architecture and collect this type of data that was only available to large companies before, they often allow you to collect data in this particular way. Even Google Analytics 4, if you look at it now, has changed the way it collects data, where everything is events, basically. And even what we had as conversions before is now just an event with a conversion flag. So this is a bit how I feel things are moving and things are working in terms of being to use product analytics in that way.
It's interesting to say in this case, rather than before, we're talking about data where you take a decision and then see the results and then make your judgment. In this case, we're saying don't take a decision. Just don't pre-set up a system where you create dependencies or relationships among your data, because then over time you'll end up getting this Gordian knot, or you'll get this singular way of thinking. Because I do know that with data scientists, it's important for them to be able to sit in front of a massive database and then not necessarily get creative, but get exploratory, where they can explore different relationships. Is there a correlation here? Is it being caused by something? And so leaving that open and leaving that kind of, as you said, kind of objective or just unopinionated. It seems it's great. It's great to talk about this stuff because the things you say make complete sense. But I wouldn't have thought about it in that way. And like, what are the different ways to do it? And so it's very insightful. So we're getting low on time, but I would be remiss if I didn't at least throw this other part at you, because I know that it's in terms of kind of more catchy things that product managers and product development involves. It talks a lot about user engagement, talking about engaging users and like the quality. We talked a little bit about how people take ownership, or they really enjoy products, what makes them recommended or not. And so I would just like to talk to you a little bit about engagement, or have you talk to us about engagement and kind of stickiness and everything. So there's this concept of engagement in product development that's key to basically what they say makes a product great. Sarah Tavel, who's now general partner at Benchmark and the former product manager of search and recommendation at Pinterest, she said, "I think user engagement as the fuel powering products. The best products take that fuel and propel the product, and with it, the company forward." So my question to you in kind of thinking about that fuel or engagement is, how do product managers drive engagement and make users kind of stick, like make them keep coming back, I guess is often the term.
Okay, definitely. So I'll maybe connect this engagement idea to an idea that people often, that almost every startup or every founder fights with or struggles with when they first start off. And then as you move along, people also struggle with is product market fit. And then I don't know if this concept really exists, but I would also talk about product market shift, that you found product market fit at a point and then the market moves away, but your product stays the same. And so you start having this kind of product market shift and things don't work together anymore. And so this, Sarah, the post she wrote, if anybody wants to find that, it's really interesting. And the hierarchy of engagement, I think it's called. And so she talks as part of engagement about this idea of a core action. And so when we talked earlier, and I'm starting to connect a few ideas here, when we talked earlier about Peter Drucker and that you need to create a customer. When we talk about creating customers, people often think about growth. We need to add more customers. We need to add more customers. We need to add more users and so on. But that's where it becomes a vanity metric when you just focus on that and you forget about people doing the core action or people doing the core action over and over again. Because if you don't have retention or if you don't have people doing the core action, you'll just have this very inflated kind of hype for a moment where you think that everything is going well. And then a couple of months later, you have to close down your company. And so that's why engagement becomes the fuel of products moving forward, because you don't only want people seeing your product or interested in your product. You want people doing the core action over and over again. You want them to connect with your particular product and be able to enjoy the product over time. So my first recommendation there is understand that you have to really sit down and think about your business and about your product, and understand what the core value. Start with the why. Why are we doing this? And what is the value that people get from our product? So once you get that and you define your one core action, I know it's difficult, but usually almost every product has one core action, one thing that is really valuable for the user. And you start with that. And then you compare that particular value to everything else in terms of how many times people are doing this particular thing at a particular date and time, and then how many people come back and do the same thing over time. And so a great tool that you can use, which I've been trying to promote a lot in different settings, is cohort analysis. Because cohort analysis basically gives you, and you can divide it in different ways. Cohorts, you can define it in different ways. You can have it by date. You can also have it by different types of user segments and so on. But just starting with a simple date cohort analysis is a very useful tool, because basically on one side, if you look at these different dates and you compare the number of users doing the core action over time, that gives you an idea of growth in terms of people doing the core action, of how engaged they are when they first come to your product, And then on the other side, the cohort analysis gives you this week by week or month by month view of how many people are coming back to do that. And so you get a sense of the retention as well. And when you're able of understanding that you have growth of people, not only all people, but people doing your core action, and them doing it over and over and over again, that's when you start getting this real valuable engagement and people coming back to your product.
Perfect. Yeah, I like what you mentioned there about retention, because it's not just about doing the action once. It's about, how, again, sticky is it? Do they keep coming back? Do they keep doing that? How frequently do they keep coming back and doing it? Is there, and then there's a ton of other ways you can slice and dice it in terms of when they're doing it, or you have all kind of things there. So, man, Kalle, this has been, there's so much more. I actually have other questions that we could ask, but we're unfortunately out of time. Are there any parting words of wisdom you would have for people in the audience out there that would like to know more about product development, or anywhere you can kind of point them in the direction before we wrap things up here?
Yeah, well, I don't know if words of wisdom, but maybe just a few resources that have been very valuable for me. So there are multiple books. There's a book I read just a couple of months ago that I found really, really interesting. It's called Product Analytics, and the author, I think, is Joanne Rodriguez, I think, if I'm not wrong. So the second half of the book becomes quite technical. It's one of the main intended audiences are data scientists specifically. So you get one section of the book which is very practical and hands-on, so might not be for everybody. But the first part gives you a very great understanding of things you have to keep in mind as you're doing these type of things. Then another resource that I find very interesting is the Product School. That's a company, they teach people how to become product managers and how to get a job as a product manager. And so the thing I like about them, even if I've never taken the training or anything, their YouTube videos and their blog posts are really, really interesting. And there's this book they have, which is called the Product Book, which I don't think is necessarily eye-opening. It's nothing there that you would say, oh, this is completely new. But the Product Book is a great summary of a lot of best practices and things that they've taken from a lot of well-known books like Inspired and The 4 Steps to Epiphany, and a lot of these other resources that are almost fundamental for product management. And they've taken a lot of those different resources and condensed that, summarized all of that in one single book. So I'd say that's a great place to start. And yeah, I'd say follow maybe our blog post on Modyo, because we'll be publishing more content related to data and so on. So I hope we can continue doing that as well.
Thanks so much for the plug, Kalle. I appreciate that. That's funny. Yeah, again, we really appreciate your time here, and it's great. It's been very insightful, and to be honest, we look forward to maybe having you back on the show in the future, because there's a lot more ground that we can still cover here. New things are changing all the time. It's a very interesting world, the world of product management, product development. So Hopefully we'll hear again from you sooner rather than later.
Okay, thank you very much, Wes. It's been a complete honor to be here. And yeah, anything you need in the future, I'll be here.
Okay, thanks so much, Kalle. See you.
Okay, bye-bye.